Bibliophiles of the internet, today I want to commemorate a very important milestone in my life by doing what else? Sharing some books. As you can most certainly ascertain from the title of this video, this is going to be a book list with books featuring characters who have had top surgery, because as of posting this, I will be officially 1 year post-op this week. So I thought this would be a cute little opportunity to briefly reflect on what my experience has been like, and then to share this very niche, very short list of books. First of all, I want to preface this by saying what I always say when I make any kind of transition-related videos, which is that I want to hold space for people who do not want or need medical transition, people who cannot access it at this time for whatever reason. Your experiences are valid and important and complex. I see you, I have been you, and I don't want to erase anyone or potentially trigger something in anyone by sharing this part of my journey and my transness. This has just been part of my experience, and if our experiences don't line up for whatever reason, that doesn't make either one of us any more or less trans. I would also be remiss if I made this video without mentioning the absolutely horrific but not unprecedented legal attacks on trans people in this country and in so many other countries. No, not every trans person wants or needs top surgery, hormones, or medical transition, or legal transition of any kind, but everyone who wants those things should be able to have them. End of sentence. In the description box, I always have a list of trans organizations, both that operate in the States and internationally, that you can help support to push back against these extremely threatening forms of legislation. So if you actually want to help us in this fight, I encourage you to look into those, among many other non-financial actions you can take. With that said, I'm a very private person, so I don't make these kinds of videos often because it's just not my thing, but I do want to share that top surgery has been one of the best experiences of my life. It has also been one of the greatest privileges of my life, yes, but it has truly made such a difference. It's something that I needed for myself, and I had to do a lot of waiting and jump through a lot of hoops to get it, but it's been just as rewarding and wonderful as it has been challenging, and I want to make sure I'm holding all of those things at once. For so much of my life, I didn't know if top surgery would even be possible for someone like me, someone who is Latina, someone who doesn't have a ton of money or resources, someone who is not young or thin or even binary in any sense. Going into it, I legitimately could not even imagine or picture what top surgery would look like on my body, what recovery would be like in my body, simply because I had absolutely no point of reference. That's one of the reasons why I'm making this video, because I want people to see that someone like me has been able to have this experience. I am here, I am happy, I am healthy, I am healed, and I exist. And just to be abundantly clear, I am volunteering this information. I am not opening the floor to questions or opinions about this subject as they relate to my experience, so please abstain from making those kinds of comments or they will be deleted. Anyways, something I wish I had even more access to going into this, besides actual resources, was stories that have characters who have been through top surgery in any kind of media, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is a kind of representation that's incredibly scarce. Spoiler alert, the list I'm gonna share is super, super short. I did so much research, both by going through my own shelves and databases, but also online, and while this is not a definitive list by any means, you're gonna see that some of these are just like cursory mentions at best. And part of that is because you can't tell whether a story mentions top surgery unless you've read it, and unless it's a major plot point, it's not something that comes up in synopses. That's another reason why I wanted to make this video, to start the conversation and establish a resource if I can. So please, if you know of any other books or stories, fiction or non-fiction, that mention top surgery in any way, please leave that down below in the comments. I also wanted to bring attention to this, again, very niche topic to show people how much further we still have to go when we talk about queer rep or trans rep in books. We are so fortunate to be living through a golden age of trans content, all things considered, but when we start to get more granular with topics like this, there's still not a lot of choices. And again, I want to be very clear and say that I'm not uplifting these stories over other trans stories. We need trans narratives that show every imaginable facet of transness, which absolutely includes not transitioning in any way, regardless of whether it's by choice or circumstance. I am not saying that we need more of these trans stories at the expense of other trans stories, just that we need more trans stories, period, that address a ton of different experiences. I think that's enough context. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from, and I kind of don't care if you don't. So with all of that said, these are the few books that I have personally read or that I know about that fit into this topic, so let's get into it. The first book that immediately came to mind was, of course, Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. This is a queer contemporary YA story about a black demi-boy named Felix who goes to this art school, and one day he finds out that not only has someone plastered pre-transition photos of him in the hallways along with his dead name, but he's also receiving anonymous transphobic messages from his classmates. Felix decides to go on the offensive and catfish one of his classmates who he suspects might be behind all of this, but that plan sort of backfires when his catfishing lands him in this weird quasi-love triangle that he did not expect. I'm not reviewing these books, I'm just commenting on them within a very specific context, but Felix Ever After was one of the first books I ever read about a young trans character who was well into their medical transition. And it's actually extremely powerful that this cover shows Felix's top surgery scars. I want to linger there for a second because it's so incredibly rare for trans bodies to be centered and celebrated in art and in media, but most especially Black trans bodies. Felix's scars are dark and pronounced and very much present, and that kind of representation is huge, especially when so much of what we see in regards to transness is often made to seem like it's inseparable from whiteness. While I wouldn't say this book is quote-unquote about transition, I also really appreciate how it does actually acknowledge what Felix's transition journey has been like. The story openly comments on what medical transition can look like for minors especially, and how Felix getting to this point has required a lot of parental consent. It seems kind of silly to say because Felix is so much younger than I am, but because this was one of the first books I read that openly acknowledged HRT and being post-op, it really made me think about how if Felix could advocate for himself in that way, then maybe that meant I could do the same thing. Felix Ever After is an amazing story about how transition is not the end of a journey, but rather the beginning of one that can unlock so many new things about yourself. I truly cannot recommend it enough. The next book I want to mention is Confessions of the Fox by Jordy Rosenberg. All of these books are written by trans authors, just for the record. This one is a blend of queer historical fiction, academia, and metafiction, and it's about this infamous 18th century thief named Jack Sheppard, who is a real historical figure, but in this story he is written as explicitly queer and trans. The story follows Dr. Voth, a college professor who is working tirelessly to document and study Jack's life. In doing so, he comes across this unofficial, unmarked manuscript that appears to be Jack's autobiography, and it's called Confessions of the Fox. As Dr. Voth is frantically trying to authenticate this manuscript, he finds himself being closely followed by some very powerful people who are just as desperate to get their hands on it. The format of this story is incredibly unique, and like I said, it is metafiction, so the experience of reading it is as if you are reading the manuscript yourself with Dr. Voth's extensive and frantic annotations. It's a little bizarre, and it's not going to be everyone's thing, but I really enjoyed it. There is a very brief portion of this story dedicated to Jack's top surgery, and it is intense. Keep in mind, Jack's portion of this story takes place in the 18th century, and the severely limited medical advancements of that time are very honestly portrayed in that process. I won't get too graphic, but there is no anesthesia. It's basically the equivalent of getting drunk, hopefully to the point of being relatively numb, and just hoping for the best. Like I said, it's pretty intense, but honestly I really respect it because it honors the gritty beginnings of that procedure, if that makes sense. When you think about it, top surgery had to start somewhere with someone, and I'm sure there is a grisly history behind it, but we only have the advancements that we have today because folks were willing to take those risks. What Jack experiences as a trans man in this story is so incredibly dangerous and unsafe, but it's also such a testament to his sense of self that he would endure those things just to have a chance to be able to live and express himself in a way that feels right. Next up is a memoir that will not surprise anyone who's been following my channel for any amount of time, but that is Sorted by Jackson Bird. Jackson Bird is a trans YouTuber, podcaster, writer, and activist, and this is his memoir about his transition process. It goes through his childhood, when he realized he was trans, how he went about expressing that, and what his experience was like pursuing medical transition, among so many other things. Whenever I bring this book up, which is often, I always point out that one of my favorite things about it is that it has a ton of resources for people who are not literate in all things trans. That includes media to consume, books to read, terminology to learn, and so much more. So it's a great primer in that sense, but Jackson's transparency about his experience with top surgery, both in this memoir and on his YouTube channel, was one of my greatest resources. To be explicitly clear, our experiences are nothing alike, and we have very little overlap logistically, but his top surgery journey was one of the first ones that I saw online, and his documentation of it gave me a pretty solid idea of what to expect. Not only does he talk about the healing process and the emotional experiences he had afterwards, but he also talks about the importance of setting realistic expectations. Jackson talks about how top surgery allows you to form a new relationship with your body, and how that relationship is not going to be straightforward or even positive right out the gate. For example, he openly talks about the possibility of post-op depression and how to prevent or lessen that experience. He also talks about how top surgery can potentially reveal different forms of dysphoria that you weren't able to previously name or recognize when so much of your prior dysphoria was maybe focused on your chest. And I'll take a second to disclaim here that the experience of dysphoria is not universal and it's not a prerequisite of being trans, but it is something that many people experience. I just really appreciate the way he talks about how top surgery is not something that will solve all of your problems as a trans person. It's an incredible milestone. It can make an exponentially positive difference in your life and quality of life over time, but the process of going through it will not automatically make your life perfect. That seems like a very obvious thing to say, but again, there's a very specific kind of trans narrative that gets repeated and shown over and over in the media and on social media that can kind of skew people's idea of top surgery or even romanticize the process. The truth is that the process can deviate from that quote-unquote norm for so many folks. So Jackson's transition-related content was absolutely foundational for me in that respect, and that's a big part of why I appreciate it so much. But I am going to move on because everyone knows I recommend this. Next, I'm going to mention a book I love that's coming out later this year, and that is The Feeling of Falling in Love by Mason Deaver. I read an early copy of this book. It is a YA T4T romance. For those who don't know, T4T denotes a relationship between two or more trans folks. This story is about a young trans boy named Neil whose best friend turned friends with benefits unexpectedly confesses his love, and Neil finds that he does not return those feelings, so they break up. However, Neil's brother is getting married over spring break, and this person was supposed to be his date. Feeling like he screwed himself over, Neil is scrambling to find a new date, and he hastily propositions his roommate, Wyatt. Especially because Neil is not super close with his family, he will definitely need a human shield of sorts if he's going to survive a week of over-the-top, lavish wedding events. Like I said, Neil is a trans boy, and he is quote-unquote post-transition when this story begins, meaning that he's living as himself, he passes pretty much 100%, and part of that is that he's over a year post-op, I believe. I don't think this is like confidential information, but part of why I read this book early was to give feedback on that specific representation, so I won't get into too many details, but I really appreciate reading about Neil's experience because it's so different from my own. This is one of those stories that reminds me of how far we still have to go when it comes to trans rep, because Neil's experience is by no means unique, but it's still one that I haven't read about before in books. He transitioned very young, he wanted to do hormone blockers, but he came out after he'd already started puberty, so that wasn't really possible. He uses testosterone patches, among so many other things. There's just a lot of little details about medical transition that we don't often get to see or discuss, and while those things aren't by no means the focus of the story, I still appreciate their presence. I just appreciate that this story is very matter-of-fact about Neil's top surgery process. It's a part of him, but it's not something that defines him. It helped him to build a better relationship with his body, but that relationship is still not perfect, and becoming more himself has not addressed the deeper disconnect he feels with his family or his friends. So again, that kind of connects with what I was talking about in regards to Sorted and that reality that top surgery can be an essential step for some people to take, but it's not a guarantee to solve all of your problems. Beyond the transition representation, I'm so glad that this story exists because it is definitely for trans people, even though it's not necessarily about transness. Trust me when I say this is not one you want to miss. The last book I've personally read that I can think of is Summer Sons by Lee Mandello. Shout out to Xander for reminding me about this one and referring me to the actual page where it was mentioned, which was very helpful in making this video. Full disclosure before I get into it, the mention of top surgery in this story is in relation to a side character, not a main character, and it is very, very brief. Summer Sons is a mixture of dark academia and queer Southern Gothic. It's about Andrew, who was very much in love with his best friend Eddie, but Eddie suddenly dies by what appears to be suicide, leaving Andrew to inherit his apartment, his car, his friends, and his unfinished research. As he navigates his grief, Andrew starts to suspect that Eddie was actually killed, especially when he picks up Eddie's research on Southern ghost stories and becomes haunted by the gruesome specter of Eddie himself, which is hell-bent on revenge and violence. Like I said, this mention of top surgery is super, super brief. It's like blink and you miss it brief, and it's in relation to Eddie's former roommate, Riley, who is trans. It's literally just this one sentence about scars under his pectorals that alludes to his transness. It's never explicitly discussed, at least from what I recall, but for people looking for that, even that small detail can make a really big impact. I've discussed this book in depth before, especially about how it's bringing a different perspective to dark academia stories and that it openly acknowledges the prevalence of privilege and whiteness when it comes to academic spaces. The other big hallmark of this story is how it explores toxic masculinity and how that is in many ways connected to the violent tradition of whiteness. Because the story is about queer men specifically, it's able to get into an even more pointed examination of how toxic masculinity is manifested within and bartered by queer white men, and the character of Riley complicates that even further when you consider how he navigates masculinity as someone who is trans. Again, because Riley's transness is implied rather than openly discussed, that commentary is much more subtle, and it really gives you even more layers to dig into when you more closely examine the book. The last book I'm going to mention is a book on my TBR. It's not out yet, I haven't read it yet, but I saw a TikTok sharing a scene that proves this book definitely belongs on this list, and that is Chef's Kiss by TJ Alexander. This comes out on May 3rd. It's a rom-com about Simone, who's working her dream job as a recipe developer for a cookbook publisher, but she finds herself struggling when the company pivots to making video content. As if that wasn't bad enough, now she has to work with Ray, the chipper and outgoing test kitchen manager who recently went viral for their series of homebrewing videos and tutorials. Naturally, Simone's boss forces her to work alongside Ray to strengthen the company's video content, and I'm sure you can guess where it goes from there. Like I said, in full transparency, I have not read this book. I cannot vouch for its quality or its content, but the TikTok I saw mentioned a scene where the two main characters have to share one bed, because I believe Simone is making sure that Ray, who just had top surgery, stays sleeping on their back. I have absolutely no context, but that scenario sounds delightfully convoluted because you don't really need someone to physically sleep with you to make sure you don't roll on your sides, but I guess if you have someone volunteering to do it, especially a cute someone, why not? I really wish I had the actual TikTok I'm referencing to let this person say it in their own words, but this one little snippet that they mentioned was enough to make me aggressively want to read this book. So if you feel the same, I thought I would pass along that information. But again, for posterity's sake, you do not need a person to keep you on your back when you're recovering from top surgery. The easiest place to be is an armchair or a couch if you have one, or at the very least, all you need is some very strategically placed pillows, I promise. So those are all the books I personally compiled. Again, this is by no means a definitive list. It is not a perfect list. As you can see, it's very American-centric, it's very white, and it's lacking in a lot of different areas, but it's what I got. Again, it's just the result of me cross-referencing books I've actually read or heard about with online resources, and of course highlighting books actually written and vetted by trans folks. If you know of any others in any genre or any medium, again, please share those in the comments down below. But yeah, happy first birthday to my chest. I hope you enjoyed this. That's everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.